Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick Smothers, and I would just like to share with you all a little bit about our Journey family history, more specifically, their involvement in the Civil War, centered around a Confederate infantry regiment known as the 4th North Carolina Infantry Regiment. Now, you may say, why is this guy from the North Woods of Wisconsin interested in a North Carolina family and a Confederate infantry unit? Well, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked. I happen to be the great grandson of a man named Elisha Estes Jurney, who lived in Iredell County in the early 1800s. His great granddaughter was Lena Celeste Jurney Gregory, and her youngest daughter, Polly, is my grandmother. Now, this man, Elisha Estes Jurney, had 4 sons and 1 grandson who were all members of the 4th North Carolina Infantry Regiment. The first son was Nathaniel Vance Jurney. Then there is Thomas Loren Jurney. Then Rufus Ace Jurney. And then Bacon Columbus Jurney. And then Elisha's grandson, William R. Jurney. He was the first son of Nathaniel Vance Jurney. He also enlisted in the regiment. Nathaniel Vance Jurney was born on March 15, 1822. He enlisted into the Confederate Army on March 1st, 1862, at the age of 39. There aren't many records of his service in the Confederate Army until around September of 1864. In September, we see him participating in a battle known as Third Winchester or the Battle of Opequon. This battle is a defeat for the South, and there are many resultant casualties in the Confederate Army, Nathaniel being one of them. He will end up being shot in the left side of his abdomen with a mini bullet. After this, he is captured by the Federal Army and becomes a prisoner of war. On October 25th, he is then sent to Point Lookout in Maryland. And this is a picture of the battle where Confederate forces are failing to fend off an attack led by General Philip Sheridan. And this is a picture of the Union prison camp that Nathaniel is sent to. Nathaniel stays here about 5 days, and then he is sent back down to Virginia in a prisoner exchange. And this here is the place called Aiken's Landing on October 30th, 1864. This is where the exchange is done. I'm not sure what Nathaniel does afterward. Perhaps there may be some family history out there about what he does. He probably just goes home because the war will be over the next spring. Now, next we have William R. Jurney. He's the son of Nathaniel and the grandson of Elisha. He was born in 1845, and he enlists into the Confederate Army on February 1st, 1863, at the age of 18. Records show that only 3 months after William enlists, he will take part in the decisive Battle of Chancellorsville, which is fought on May 1st through the 3rd in 1863, which is a major Southern victory. In this battle, the famous Stonewall Jackson makes a daring attack on the Federal Army's unsuspecting right flank. In fact, Jackson uses the brigade of the 4th North Carolina as the spearhead of his attack. Unfortunately, although this is a great victory for Southern arms, William Jurney will be mortally wounded in this battle, dying on the 7th day of May. 3 days later, on the 10th of May, the South will use yet another valuable soldier when General Stonewall Jackson dies from complications of the injuries that he received during the battle. William is buried in the Confederate cemetery in Spotsylvania, Virginia. Next, we have Thomas Loren Jurney, who was born on March 12, 1834. Now, he would actually be conscripted or drafted into the Confederate Army on August 8, 1862, at the age of 32. The Confederate Congress, after realizing that the war may wear on, using up valuable resources and manpower, decided that a military draft would be needed. After a much heated debate with some Southern politicians declaring that they traded Tyrant Lincoln for a new tyrant named Jefferson Davis, the Confederate Conscription Act was passed on April 16, 1862. Now, this act would make all white males between the ages of 8 and 35 to be eligible for the draft. And later, as the war continued, the draft would be extended to include males between 17 and 50 years of age. Now, what we see of Thomas records is him being admitted into the hospital in Richmond on May 12, 1863, because of rheumatoid arthritis. Later in June, he is admitted to the Farmville Hospital, diagnosed with kidney disease. Thomas will be mustered out of the service in March of 1864. Next, we have Rufus Ace Jurney, who was born on March 10, 1836. And at the age of 26, he will also be drafted on August 8, 1862, the same day as his brother Thomas. What I can find about Rufus is that he appears to become sick in November of 1862, and he is given a medical furlough to go back home to North Carolina. However, there are some internet accounts of him swimming through the cold waters and creeks and rivers in order to get home in late November. And when that happens, he contracts a severe case of pneumonia. Rufus Jurney will die of pneumonia, I assume at home, on November 30th, 1862. Lastly, we have Bacon Columbus Jurney. Now, he was born on September 10th, 1840, and he enlists into the Confederate Army on June 13th, 1862 or 1861 at the age of 20. Bacon will go with the regiment to its encampment near Manassas, Virginia. And there are many sources that say that this first encampment had very unsanitary conditions and that disease was rampant in the camp. Well, unfortunately, Bacon will contract one of these dreadful diseases, which is in the form of typhoid pneumonia. He will be sent to Globe Hospital in Richmond because of this. And Bacon Jurney will later die of typhoid fever or typhoid pneumonia on December 20th, 1861. And this here would be a picture of Globe Hospital that's in Richmond, Virginia. Now, let's get into a little history of the 4th North Carolina Infantry Regiment. The 4th North Carolina was organized in Garysburg, North Carolina at a place called Camp Hill in May of 1861. Colonel George Burgoyne Anderson of Hillsborough, North Carolina, will be selected to become the regiment's commanding officer. 3 companies of recruits will eventually be furnished for the 4th North Carolina Infantry by Iredell County. They would be Company A, the Iredell Blues, Company C, the Saltillo Boys, and Company H, which was the Hunting Creek Guards or the Independent Grays. A little known fact was that during the war, the good people of Statesville decided to change the name of their town to States Rightsville. It would keep that name until the end of the war. Another county that supplied men for the 4th North Carolina Infantry was Rowan County. From there came Company B, the Scotch Ireland Greys, and Company J, the Rowan Rifle Guard. From Wayne County would come Company D, the Hillsborough, the Goldsboro Volunteers. And from Beaufort County would come Company E, the Southern Guards, and Company I, which is the Pamlico Rifles. Also from Wilson County would come Company F, the Wilson Light Infantry. And from Davie County would come Company G, the Davie Sweepstakes. Now, when the regiment leaves North Carolina, it goes to Manassas Junction. And at Manassas Junction, the Confederate forces were under the command of Major General Joseph E. Johnston. It was during this time period that Bacon-Columbus journey caught typhoid in the camp and was sent to Richmond, Virginia. Toward the beginning of 1862, President Lincoln and the politicians in Washington would grow tired of the large Confederate force being a threat to the city. So a soldier named George B. McClellan was summoned to Washington to take over Union forces and to work out a plan to outmaneuver Joseph Johnston. What George McClellan devised was to take the Federal Army on boats all the way down to the James Peninsula. This would outmaneuver the rebels and put the Union Army in a good position to capture Richmond. McClellan landed on the peninsula and laid siege to Yorktown. He quickly captured it when the Confederates abandoned it. However, McClellan was by nature overly cautious and slow to move. While McClellan's army was slowly deploying on the peninsula, Johnston was able to move his army south to meet the threat. On May 5th, the rebels tried to hold off federal forces at Williamsburg, Virginia, and as they retreated up the peninsula toward Richmond, the 4th North Carolina would take part in this delaying action. It was at this time that Joe Johnston thought it would be best to bring all the Confederate forces nearer to Richmond to coalesce around it and to defend the city. And as the rebel army came together just east of the city, Johnston devised a plan of attack with his subordinate, Major General James Longstreet. As the Federal armies fanned out and became separated by the Chickahominy River, Longstreet and another Major General, Daniel Harvey Hill, who is a North Carolinian, would take their divisions and attack half of the Federal army that was there south of the river. And at this point in the war, the 4th North Carolina would be in Hill's division, commanded by Major General Daniel Harvey Hill. And it was in Featherston's brigade, commanded by Colonel George B. Anderson. The 4th would be led at this time by Major Brian Grimes. So General Hill decides to carry out the before mentioned battle plans, and the result is known as the Battle of Seven Pines or Fair Oaks. Now, this is the first major battle that the 4th North Carolina Infantry Regiment is part of. Around 1 p.m., General Hill throws his brigade at the unprepared Union forces, and the battle becomes hot and severely contested. During the battle, the 4th North Carolina goes in with 520 men and 25 officers. Although it does its job and captures the enemy works, it loses 462 men and 24 officers in the process. Also, General Joe Johnston is wounded while directing the Confederate forces, thus leaving the rebels without direction for the night. Now that Joe Johnston is wounded and unable to lead, the Confederate Army needs a new leader. It is at this time that President Jefferson Davis picks a man named Robert E. Lee to renew the fight against the Union Army. So, as General Lee assesses the situation, he sets his men to digging and entrenching while the Federals draw closer to Richmond. Some of the soldiers do not like this idea of warfare, and they don't know what to think of their new commander. So the new commander is mocked with names like Granny Lee or the King of Spades. However, what Lee was actually doing was preparing adequate defenses for around Richmond for less soldiers to man. And with the rest of his army, he would take up the offensive. With the Federal forces still astride and separated by the Chickahominy River, Lee decides to throw his army against McClellan. And in the campaign now known as the 7 Days Battle, Lee makes a series of hard-hitting attacks. The first such assault is on the Union Army at Mechanicsville on June 26, 1862. That opens up the 7 days battles. And then as the Federals fall back, Lee hits them again at Gaines Mill on June 27th. Then on June 29th, Lee attacks the Union at Savage's Station. And then on June 30th, Lee has a chance to severely cripple McClellan's retreating army. However, because of confusion and mixed up orders, the Federals are allowed to escape the destruction plotted for them. Then on July 1st, the Confederates come upon the Federals in an entrenched defensive position at a place called Malvern Hill. Lee decides to attack anyway, and after defending a series of bloody assaults, the Federals are able to hold on to their position. However, McClellan's army has lost all initiative, and sensing the low morale from his troops throughout the attacks on the 7 days, and the increasing casualty list of his men, and the growing frustration from politicians above him in Washington, McClellan decides to end the campaign and evacuate the James Peninsula. So at this time, Richmond is no longer threatened, and General Robert E. Lee is hailed by the South as one of its greatest generals. Actually, the savior of Richmond. So while McClellan is leaving the peninsula, a new threat comes from Washington in the form of General John Pope and his army. While Lee decides how to deal with him, he keeps Daniel Harvey Hill's troops, which would include the 4th North Carolina Infantry, in the capital of Richmond to man and improve its defenses and keep it fortified. What Lee decides to do is reorganize his army into 2 corps. One corps will be led by Major General James Longstreet, and the other corps will be led by Major General Thomas Jonathan Jackson. They take the rebel north to counter Pope and eventually meet on the plains of Manassas. Pope attacks the Confederates and is decisively defeated in the battle known as Second Manassas or Second Bull Run. Lee then decides it would be best to move the theater of operations northward so that Virginia could get a little relief during harvest time. In order to launch this invasion, he brings up more men from Richmond, which would include the division of Daniel Harvey Hill and the 4th North Carolina Regiment. A defeated John Pope is replaced by George McClellan, and the Union armies, prodded by a severely distressed government in Washington, quickly go after the Confederates. In a stroke of good luck, McClellan somehow gets a copy of Confederate orders and figures out where Lee is. And in rapid determination that is somewhat uncharacteristic of George McClellan, he pushes the Federal army quickly and hits the rebels hard at a place called South Mountain. Daniel Harvey Hill is here with his division, and he and the 4th North Carolina make a courageous stand, holding off the Federals while the rest of the rebels are able to concentrate at Sharpsburg, Maryland. So at this particular point in the campaign, the level of Hill's command is like this. Hill's division is commanded by Harvey Hill. Anderson's brigade is under Brigadier General George B. Anderson. And the 4th North Carolina is once again commanded by Colonel Brian Grimes. All these men are fellow North Carolinians. They become part of the 2nd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia under the command of Stonewall Jackson. Now, following the defense at South Mountain, the rebel army comes together at Sharpsburg, Maryland. McClellan hits them hard on September 17, 1862. All day there is heavy fighting around a creek named Antietam. Lee and the Confederates used every last ounce of their resources to fend off the attack after Savage's attack. During the battle, the North Carolinians under Harvey Hill used a sunken road as a form of a trench to defend their position. For 4 hours, the North Carolinians desperately fought off 4 separate Union attacks, all while giving and receiving many casualties. It was here that the 4th North Carolina lost its brigade commander, George Anderson, who was mortally wounded while leading his men. The sunken road will be named Bloody Lane after this battle. After the battle, the brigade would be given to Brigadier General Stephen Dodson Ramseur, who is a fellow North Carolinian from Lincolnton, North Carolina. So, after the northern invasion fails, Lee takes the army south to again counter the threat of federal advances in Virginia. Lincoln finally gets exasperated with the slow, plodding McClellan and replaces him with General Ambrose Burnside. Continually hassled and pestered by Washington for results, Burnside decides to move against Lee's entrenched army at Fredericksburg on December 13, 1862. Waves of Federal soldiers assault the Confederate defenses to no avail and with galling casualties. This becomes a major victory for the Confederacy. After Hill's division is placed under the command of Brigadier General Robert Rhodes, now I assume this is because of Daniel Harvey Hill's irritability and personality conflict with Robert E. Lee, or pretty much everyone else, or Hill is later sent to the Western Theater of Operations and is still under Ramseur's brigade, and Brian Grimes is controlling the North Carolina infantry. So after the Union disaster at Fredericksburg, Ambrose Burnside is replaced by General Joseph Hooker. He tries to outflank the Confederate defenses at Fredericksburg, but is quickly intercepted by Lee and his forces. In a daring move, Lee and Stonewall Jackson split up their army, and while Lee holds the attention of the Federals with his part, Jackson sneaks his men around the unsuspecting and undefended flank of the Union Army. At Chancellorsville on May 2nd, Jackson surprises the Federals with a hard-hitting assault and drives them for miles. Jackson actually uses Rhodes' division and the 4th North Carolina Infantry for the spear tip of this daring assault. Ramseur's brigade is actually the lead brigade for this attack. However, although Chancellorsville is a great victory for Confederate arms, it comes with a price. This is where William R. Jurney falls, mortally wounded, and he will die of his wounds on May 7, 1863. Also, the South will lose the services of the legendary Stonewall Jackson at this time. He is wounded during the battle and succumbs to his injuries on May 10, 1863. The whole South will mourn his death. So after the death of Jackson, generally needs a new way to rearrange his troops. At the division level, the arrangement from the North Carolina is the same. Rhodes' division is commanded by now Major General Robert Rhodes, with Brigadier General Stephen Ramseur commanding his brigade, and the 4th North Carolina still under Colonel Brian Grimes. However, Lee creates a 3rd Corps for the Confederate Army, with Lieutenant General Richard Ewell taking over the 2nd Corps in place of Stonewall Jackson, and Lieutenant General A.P. Hill taking over the newly created 3rd Corps for the Army of Northern Virginia. After the recent victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, the Confederate Army is in very high spirits. General Lee decides that an invasion of the North would be the best course of action, and because it would give war-torn Virginia a break and perhaps distract General Grant's campaign against Vicksburg, Mississippi in the West. And if it was successful, it could possibly create a major victory near Washington that could eventually lead to Southern independence. And as the Confederates move north, Hooker is replaced by General George Meade. The two armies have a chance meeting at a town in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. And on the first day of the battle, Robert Rhodes leads his North Carolina brigades against the Federals, capturing many of the Federals and forcing them back through the town. In fact, the 4th North Carolina, led by Colonel Brian Grimes, is reported to be the first Confederate regiment to enter Gettysburg on that day. Although the first day of Gettysburg went well for the Confederates, the attacks against the Federal position on the 2nd were not as successful. And the attack known as Pickett's Charge that took place on the 3rd was actually a complete disaster. Having lost a 3-day battle, the Confederate army is forced to retreat. Lee will take the army back to Virginia, and with a few exceptions that are minor actions, he will stay on the defensive against Meade through the rest of 1864. Now, weary of the continually prodding George Meade to no avail, a frustrated Washington decides to bring over General Ulysses Sampson Grant from the Western Theater to take command of the Federal Army. Grant starts out by moving south when the weather makes it possible, and as Grant moves south, Lee attacks him in the wilderness on May 5th. Lee hits the Federals hard and roughs them up pretty badly, and the battle is considered by many to be a tactical Southern victory. However, General Grant, unlike previous commanders, decides not to retreat. This now becomes a war of attrition, and which is one that the Confederates are not likely to win. So Grant heads south again and is blocked by Lee at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Here, Grant will make repeated attacks against Lee's line at the cost of many casualties for both sides. During one such attack, the Federal Army will make a breakthrough at a place called the Muleshoe. The men of the 4th North Carolina will suffer many losses when they lead a desperate counterattack to restore the Confederate line here. Grant again tries to outmaneuver Lee and is stopped by Confederate defensive actions at Hanover Junction on May 22nd. Again, Grant tries to get around Lee and is stopped at Cold Harbor. Grant orders a major Federal attack on Lee's defenses at Cold Harbor and is soundly defeated. Grant suffers almost 13,000 casualties in 3 days of the severest fighting of the war. After this, Grant decides one more time to try to get around Lee. He is unable to capture the defenses of the city of Petersburg before Lee gets there with his troops to man them. Grant decides at this time to lay siege to the city. So while the siege is going on, Lee decides to take some troops out in the Shenandoah Valley under Jubal Early to meet another threat coming from Washington. So at this time, the 4th North Carolina is in the division of General Robert Rhodes. General Ramseur was given command of another division, so the brigade went to Colonel William Cox. And because Brian Grimes is commanding another brigade, the 4th North Carolina is led by Captain S.A. Kelly. So Lee sends Jubal Early, Lieutenant General Jubal Early, northeast along the Shenandoah Valley to meet the threat of Federal invasion there. So there, the Confederate forces under General Early clashed with the Federals under the command of Philip Sheridan. The two armies meet at Winchester, Virginia on September 19, 1864. Now the Confederates are hit hard and suffer many casualties here. This will be where Nathaniel Jurney is wounded and captured, and also Division Commander Robert Rhodes is killed during the battle. Then the Confederates make a final push, and a battle is fought at Cedar Creek. This is also a Confederate defeat in which Major General Stephen Ramseur is mortally wounded while directing his troops. So after this, Grant will apply incredible pressure on both Petersburg and Richmond, forcing Confederate forces to evacuate both cities. As General Lee retreats with his army westward, lines of supply and communication are broken, and the Southern Army is forced to surrender at a place called Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Major General Brian Grimes would be the division commander that surrendered the men of the 4th North Carolina to the Federals. Okay, so that was a short history of the 4th North Carolina throughout the war. And if you enjoyed this presentation and would like me to do other videos about family or military history, then give me a like and a share. I would like to do more videos about the 4th North Carolina's involvement in particular battles. So if you would like to add any information about the Jurney family, then please don't hesitate to send it to me. This presentation could always use some improvement and fine-tuning. Or if you didn't like the video at all, just say so and I'll try to make sure it doesn't get to you. So if you would like to read and research on your own, there are limitless resources to go to. Anything about the Eastern Theater of the Civil War would help you. Or there's also Edwin Osborne, who was a member of the 4th North Carolina Infantry, wrote about its history entitled The 4th Regiment. You can find that online. Or there are also great books by Shelby Foote and Stephen Sears that provide good details on the war. So that's all for now. And if you are still here with me, then have a great day and God bless.